Hi Neil, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing great too. We had a little mix up with technical stuff in the background, but no, we are fine and we are recording with good old Skype.
Yes.
So it's some kind of, yeah, let's call it a tradition to ask an interview partner about his home computer history and where he started and where he got from there. So maybe you can tell us something where you started?
Sure. The my first home computer was actually not what most people would consider to be a computer. It was something that Radio Shack produced for a while. It was basically a glorified calculator, but you could do basic programming on. And so I can't remember what the model number of it was, but it was very very simple, and but you could run programs in BASIC on it, and so that was the first thing that I ever had that was computer like. But around the time I was getting into high school, my I talked my parents into getting me an Atari 400. And of course, as we all know, is the Atari 400 was basically sort of like the Atari 2600. You could slap cartridges in it and play games. But of course, I sold them on the fact that I could write my school papers on it.
Sure, we
Uh,
all did that.
and so that was it was the Atari 400. 400 was, again, it was a computer. It had a membrane keyboard on it. Uh, and so it took a lot of work to kind of type on the thing, but I learned how to do programming on it. I learned how to, and of course, my first word processing, learning how to do cut and paste and all that kind of fun stuff. So that was all with an Atari, and then I stayed with Atari for my next three computers. And so I had an 800, and then I graduated to a 520 ST. I
Hmm.
always love talking about the 520 ST simply because, to the best of my knowledge, it is the only computer that ever shipped with MIDI ports built in as standard part of the computer. And the Atari actually used their MIDI ports as a weird kind of funky LAN. And so they had networking kind of built into the Atari 520 ST. And of course, one of the reasons I particularly had stuck with the 520 was because I was a very much interested in electronic music, and there were a lot of artists who were using the Atari because there were a lot of really great MIDI programs available. And one of my big heroes at the time was Jean-Michel Jarre. And he was actually one of the people that helped advertise for Atari. So that's where I got started, was kind of running through the different iterations of the Atari home computer.
Hmm. So you would say the Atari ST is your favorite system?
Well, I mean, for whenever I was a kid, obviously there were the other brands are out there. There was, of course, the Apple II
Hmm.
was sort of one of the big computers, but the Apple II was just incredibly expensive versus the Atari, because the Atari was pitched at more, sort of the home computer for families or kids. And so, of course, the Amiga and the Commodore were out. First the Commodore 64 and then the Amiga. The Amiga had amazing graphics,
Hmm.
but for me, I like I say, I particularly enjoy the Atari 520 ST, simply because, again, it allowed me to compose music and to edit music on the computer, and so that was one of my favorite things about that system.
Oh, so you mostly did creative stuff with your computer, other than the rest of us who mostly did gaming stuff on their
Oh well,
computers.
yeah. Of course, I bought the I had the cartridges for the 400 and the 800, and then it lost the game cartridge slot for the 520
Hmm.
ST, and so I bought several of my first computer games for that one. I had Zork, and pretty much all the Infocom text games
Hmm.
from back in the day. So Planetfall and Zork and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I still think is one of the best uh, early computer games out there that was purely text based. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was incredible.
Hmm.
And of course, I was a big fan of the Hitchhikers series to begin with. But the wonderful thing about the text game is it took it off in whole new directions. But ironically, a lot of the I didn't really do a lot of computer gaming on the Atari simply because when I got to the 520 ST, you're largely dealing with floppies and things like that, and I uh, I wasn't actually doing as much gaming with it. But I had a friend of mine who had bought a Bard's Tale for his Commodore 64, and so a lot of the gaming I did with sort of my buddies, and they had the games for their computers, and so I was interested in that sort of thing, but it was just I didn't really have a lot of the spare cash to buy the games myself.
Also, playing with a friend is the best way to play any role-playing game, I think. So
Oh
you,
yeah. Well, and it was kind of a natural outgrowth for me simply because this buddy was actually the person who traditionally ran the dungeon master or the dungeon D&D group that I played with, and
oh, the pen
so
and paper.
we started off doing the pen and paper kind of stuff, and so it was just sort of became a natural outgrowth because whenever he bought Bard's Tale, we would go over there to his house, and so sometimes rather than having a regular pen and paper session, he would load up Bard's Tale, and we would just kind of collectively sit around and play it together. And just in terms of he would be driving around, and then he'd kind of pull all the different players and ask, what do you think I should do next? Should I attack or should I, go here? And so it was kind of funny because we're role playing, but we were role playing in this sort of new way.
Yeah, that sounds very, very cool. I guess you don't have any of the games or systems anymore, right?
Oh no, no.
No.
I mean, just over the years, it just, I you're whenever you're really young, you're not nostalgic. You're not thinking about, well,
Hmm.
I really want to hold on to this because in 15 or 20 years, I'm really going to want this experience, still have this experience. You're thinking about what's the neatest, best, better, cooler computer out there. And so my computers ended up being hand me downs to cousins, and so a
Oh,
lot of them
right.
ended up with my older systems. And then just as they became non-functional or they didn't have programs, they probably ended up in waste dumps or something or whatever. So sadly, I don't have access to any of those old computers. It would be fun to still have my Atari 400 simply because that's sort of where my real journey began.
Hmm.
Was learning some of the programming kinds of stuff that I did with the Atari back in the day.
Hmm.
But that it was I have a lot of fond memories of it.
Yeah, and that's the most important part.
Yes.
Yeah, then maybe we can move over to the second part. How exactly did your journey in the game industry start? Did you had a friend who said to you, "Let's make a game together," or how did
Uh,
that start?
well, that's so I was one of those individuals that growing up in the 80s. I'm not the first generation to play games, but we're mine was the first generation of people who were dealing with commercial computer games, obviously, and uh, so I was really excited by I was interested in the idea of working in the computer gaming industry. I remember when the movie War Games came out, which was a big deal. It had Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy, and it involved this kid hacking into here. He was trying to hack into a games company to find out what their upcoming games were, and of course it ends up not really being about computer games the way that we know them, but it was, I think, a watershed moment for a lot of folks of my particular generation, because a lot of us looked at and said, "This kid's really smart. He knows how to, use computers, and he builds games." And so I was really interested in that sort of thing. And so I did go out and I bought a bunch of manuals about programming and all this kind of stuff. And so, but the problem that I had was the fact that at the end of the day, I'm not a numbers person. I didn't really enjoy programming like other people did, and so I did do create some stuff on my computer. I built a version of Defender that was really terrible, uh, uh, and so I learned how to do some basics with it or whatever. But I didn't actually end up getting into the games industry until I decided that whenever I went to college, is I was going to go into journalism, because writing is sort of a forte of mine. And so I decided that I was going to focus on writing and possibly working in radio. But when a friend of mine who I'd known since junior high had gotten a job doing illustrations for a game called Task Force Games, and Task Force Games had been the makers of the tabletop, desktop game Starfleet Battles, which of course was a strategy version, basically taking Star Trek and making it into ship-to-ship battles. Mm-hmm. So he'd gotten a job illustrating for Task Force Games, and after a while, Task Force Games got purchased by New World Computing, and New World Computing were the people who made the Might and Magic games. And so he got hired to go work for New World Computing. And after he got there, he contacted me, and they initially talked to me possibly about being a artist for them, but I didn't think I had enough artistic talent to really be even used to them. But they ultimately ended up having a writer/designer position opening up. And so that was sort of how I got in the door there, is because my friend Kenneth gave me an invitation and had recommended me to the boss at New World, John Van Caneghem. And so they brought me out so that I could start working for them. And so that was sort of my entry into the industry was through Ken Mayfield.
Mm-hmm. That was about 1990, right?
That would have been 1990, yes.
Yeah. And after working on different titles, you switched over to Dynamics? How did that happen?
So how that happened is that while I was working on Planet's Edge, we had a good friend of mine, or someone who became a good friend of mine, was John Cutter, who had recently left what was a Cinemaware. And so John came over to New World Computing, and his job there was to help produce for the Might and Magic series, but also Planet's Edge. And I think It Came from the Desert and a few other projects that New World was working on at the time. So John and I, during the time that I was writing and working on Planet's Edge, we got to be really good friends. And so whenever he got an offer to go work at Dynamics, I told him before he left, I said, I really enjoy working with you. He, had really personally kind of taken me under his wing to sort of mentor me. And so whenever he made that jump, I said that if something opens up at Dynamics, I would really like to hear about it, because again, I'd love to have an opportunity to keep working with you, just simply because we just had such really good working relationship, so that we just sort of understood each other really well. And so I kind of put it out there that if they ended up needing somebody, then I would be really happy to go and work with him at Dynamics. And so just not too long after he went to Dynamics, just a few months later, is whenever he gave me the phone call and said, hey, we need you to come up and write for the game that would ultimately become Betrayal at Krondor.
Mm-hmm. And guilty pleasure of mine is a game where I think you wrote the manual for Battledrome, or story or stuff like that?
I worked on the manual for Battledrome. Yes, that
Yeah.
is an obscure tidbit. Yes, but
Yeah.
yes, yes, is I they needed somebody to. That was sort of in after I finished upon Betrayal at Krondor, and they were trying to figure out what to do with me because they had canceled the sequel to Betrayal at Krondor and some other stuff was going on. So in the meantime, I'm down there twiddling my thumbs. And so they said, "Well, we've got a writer. We're not doing anything with him." So yes, they had me go and work on the manual for Battledrome there, and so there were a few other things that they kind of kicked around or whatever. They had a golf game they were working on, and they said, "Well, maybe you could go work as a designer on that." And I said, "I have no idea what I would do with a golf game."
Yeah.
And so it's just so not who I am. I said, unless you let me do something really weird and perverted, and we'll be a golf game, but it'll be set in outer space and you're fighting monsters. I don't know. Uh, and so, but yeah, so that that's something that I have done periodically over the years. That has been one of my. Of course, I wrote the manual for King's Bounty whenever I was at New World Computing. There was Tunnels and Trolls, which was actually the first title I worked at New World. I wrote the manual and the hint manual for Tunnels and Trolls. And of course, the Betrayal at Krondor one. And then another manual that I did many years later that I actually had a great deal of fun working on was actually for a game called Nox, which was out in Westwood.
Westwood, yeah.
And so I wrote the manual for Nox. And I really enjoyed writing that manual. That was fun. But so that's something that I've kind of done as people sort of needed help on various things, and so I think I did some work as well on whenever Chris Taylor was working on not on Supreme Commander, but on Total Annihilation.
Mm-hmm.
I actually did some of that kind of stuff for him that was not in the game itself, but some other background material, and I think some stuff that even ended up in the manual for Total Annihilation. And so that's been sort of my stealth thing that people don't necessarily know about, and people aren't going, "Wow, this is such a fantastic manual." But I actually really appreciate really well written manuals that add something to it beyond, okay, this is how the button works. So
yeah, right. Because for me and most of my viewers, I think the manual is a big part of the immersion into the game, because normally you read the manual before you are playing the game, and you read it and you are fantasizing about the possibilities in the open world which the game will create for you and stuff like that. So the manual is very, very important, yeah.
Well, there was a gold standard for me was actually not something I wrote myself, but I always wanted to create a manual like it, and I never really quite got the go ahead to do that. Was the Darklands manual?
Oh yes,
and which was just an incredibly even if you never played the game, the Darklands manual was fabulous, and I was really pushing to do something like that, but we just ended up not having the time or the budget to really do it, and I was sad about that, because there was a whole bunch of backstory stuff that I created for Dungeon Siege that I would have loved to have had in that particular manual. But anyway, but so I know that your readers aren't just dying to hear about manuals, but but it's something that I have kind of enjoyed doing, because it's an opportunity sometimes to put a lot of stuff on the page that they don't get to experience directly during the game. And so you have back histories and information about the world and characters and the stuff that they wouldn't ordinarily really have opportunity to come across while playing the game. And so I think it can be a really cool sort of thing. That's the one thing about with purely electronic games. You don't really necessarily have that cool electronic version of the manual sitting off to the side, which I think is kind of a shame.
It is.
Because in some respects you go, wow, here's an opportunity because you're not restricted by, well, there can only be X number of pages because there's the printing budget and we can only have so much color and so on and so forth. It's, well, it's electronic. No one cares. We can make it 5,000 pages long. you know, uh, but anyway.
After your computer history and your work history, let's talk a bit about Planet's Edge. Obviously, it's for me obvious. It's inspired by games like Star Control 1 and 2 and Starflight, Hard Nova, etc. Did you play the games before, or did you came up with the design and it somehow fit into the genre and category of the other games?
So whenever I was brought aboard to do Planet's Edge, as I'd mentioned before, is that Neural Computing had purchased the rights to Starfleet battles, and so the original mission statement, whenever John Van Caneghem, had basically, whenever I'd kind of got done with the first couple of things I worked on there, and we were setting out for what's going on, is the plan was to take Starfleet battles and integrate it and make basically just a computer-driven version of Starfleet Battles, which is perfect because whenever you're playing it as a tabletop game, it sometimes you have a normal game might be 8 hours, and there's just lots of tedious sort of record keeping that was sort of required for that game. If we could hand off a lot of that record keeping and calculation to a computer and just concentrate on the tactics, we could make this a lot more interesting. And so it started off just being a computerized emulation of Starfleet battles. But as we went into it, we said, well, we're flying around in this spaceship, and of course this is based on Star Trek. These are the ships and the alliances and all that stuff in Task Force game or in Starfleet battles was all derived from Star Trek. And I said, that being the case, wouldn't it be kind of cool is if you're flying around in space and you're doing all your space battles and all this other kind of stuff, but then you would come up to a planet and you would beam down, and then you would have adventures like you would have if you were watching an episode of Star Trek. And so that sort of became the metaphor that we went to, is that you have the space battle stuff, but then you would beam down and it would turn into a role-playing game. And of course, obviously, Neural Computing being a major role-playing house with Might and Magic, so the first idea is that it was going to be like Might and Magic on the ground, but we decided that we wanted to go to a different look because there was already, there were always going to be a lot of resources devoted to the space combat, and so we wanted to do something for the RPG system that was different than Might and Magic. So it wasn't going to be that sort of 2D and a half look that you got with Might and Magic, and so we were kind of looking around, and obviously the something that seemed like it might be simpler to implement and would give us a different feel to the RPG element than Might and Magic was to go something that was isometric, and so we ended up with that sort of Ultima looking top-down view that we ended up with in Planet's Edge. And so we, of course, obviously we didn't, even though we had the rights to using the stuff that was in Task Force, in Starfleet battles, and that those are all had kind of Star Trek affiliations to them, we didn't have any rights to characters or anything like that from the Star Trek universe. And so the problem was to say, well, if we're going to do this, then we want to, we're going to have to create our own universe, our own characters and stories that will be unique to us. And so that's the point at which, even though we were essentially making the space combat like Starfleet battles, it was not going to be Starfleet battles. It was not going to carry that label. And of course, in terms of implementing that space battle, yes, we were looking at Star Control. That was out there because playing that and looking at that and some Starflight, we were looking at those other games that are out there, and those were certainly influences while we were looking at things. Another thing that actually had a major impact on the role playing aspect of everything was the fact that we were looking at science fiction space role playing systems that already existed, and of course, the big boy in the block whenever I had been growing up had been Traveller. And so we said Traveller would make that Traveller would probably be the best system to kind of look at for inspiration for how the RPG element of everything worked. And so really what Planet's Edge ended up being was a fusion between Starfleet Battles and Traveller. Also with some other kind of elements. I was a huge fan of Call of Cthulhu, so there's some weird mechanics we kind of threw in under the hood that kind of came from my background of playing Call of Cthulhu. Not from the horror element, but just some of the very simplistic sort of mechanics that were involved with the Chaosium's systems for doing role-playing games. So that's really how the idea first kind of came together, was evolving something that was originally just space combat, and then adding on the RPG element, and then it just kind of organically grew out of that. And so it was less about looking at other existing computer games, and its DNA was more related to existing pen and paper kinds of games.
When you started designing the space combat, was there first plan to make it in a turn-based, or was it always the idea to make it real-time?
Oh, it was definitely, we wanted to make it real-time. Because again, the thought is that with the original pen and paper game, it took so long to accomplish anything, and it was just, at times it would be agonizing, because I said it would be not unusual, particularly if you had a game with multiple players involved or whatever. It might be 8, 10, 12 hours for one session of playing Starfleet Battles. So I think that you said, unfortunately, it takes all the sexiness out of a space battle whenever you start off. And, okay, so we both started our opposite ends of the map, and we're all cruising in. So, okay, so it might be an hour before we actually got to do anything. It's just, okay, I'm just doing all the stuff, maneuvering around, and I'm filling out my allocation sheets. And so I think that we definitely wanted to have a sense of a lot more action and have a lot more immediacy towards, we want something that feels like, watching a space battle. And so, firing the photon torpedoes, and they hit, and there's an explosion. And so we wanted to have something that felt much more immediate, and that was not fire and then wait and see what happens.
Yeah. I'm asking because I think Planet's Edge is a more action-oriented RPG than all the others at the time, because there are, I think, 3 or 4 character attributes and 20 abilities or stuff like that. You can't level up, and this makes the impression on me that it was planned to be fast action with a deep and rich story.
Yes, and part of that is again, when it comes to the RPG elements of the game, that's definitely the DNA that we're bringing in from Traveller and from Call of Cthulhu. Because whenever you look at at Dungeons and Dragons, you have all these stats, and you're leveling up all this other stuff, and you start off as, I can barely kill a rat, and then you get to like the higher levels, and I'm fighting gods. And our notion was that, as with Traveller, it's mainly about the stuff you carry. That's what makes you powerful. Is so the items that you acquire, so better armor, better guns, better what have you. And so the emphasis is on the stuff rather than the characters themselves. And because we were going to have, you have essentially those 4 characters through the entire through the entire experience. We just felt that it was going to be much more interesting to say, well, what cool item can I acquire? Then I can switch them around between different characters, and stick with the idea that it's about the stuff. And honestly, from a management standpoint, from programming and everything else, it was much easier to deal with stuff, attributes that are attached to your items that you're carrying, rather than kind of attaching to different characters and dealing with modifiers and all the other crazy stuff. And so if it's all based on the stuff you're carrying, it was actually much easier on the back end for us to deal with stuff. So but yeah, it's in that respect, it was not really about deep, characteristics or deep, kind of stuff like that. It was more about just the adventure and the exploration and telling a goofy story as we went along.
Yeah. So I was wondering, because you first started with Might and Magic 3, I think, and I was wondering how many inspirations from Might and Magic got into Planet's Edge, but there weren't that much, right?
Well, the main thing that Planet's Edge inspired, it was never going to be, it was never going to connect up with the mythos of the Might and Magic games. It was always intended to be a separate thing. But one thing that it definitely inherited from New World Computing and from the Might and Magic stuff is that it is a very goofy game and kind of a goofy universe, and that was really kind of a trademark for New World. There's very little that's done at New World that took itself very seriously. Puns were almost required in almost every game that was produced out of there, and I just think it was just because the attitude that everybody there is, first of all, we were all, we were young guys in our 20s for the most part. There were a handful of old guys that were, 30. I think John had turned 30 or just about 30 by the time I got there. But for the most part, most of us in the company were kids. And so we, none of us really took any of this other stuff kind of seriously. We filled it up with all the stupid puns. Of course, Star Trek was a big deal at the company, and so we're all Trekkies, and so there are tons of Star Trek, puns. But I was a Doctor Who fan, so there were Doctor Who jokes kind of scattered through all the other stuff. But no, it didn't. Other than that, I don't think there was a lot of stuff that it carried over from Might and Magic. And as I said, the mythos was never intended to kind of cross over with Might and Magic. So it was more about the spirit of how we approached not just the game, but also the game experience. Because at the end of the day, we said it's just got to be fun. It's got to be one of those things. Whenever you're done playing the thing, is that you got a smile on your face and you're not worried about how consistent is the universe. And there's in Planet's Edge, there's an example of one of the each one of the planets you beam down to is essentially a self-contained episode of Star Trek. Each planet had its own episode title, and so there was one that was sort of my homage to Phantom of the Opera. There's this sort of impossible love story, and part of which involves one of the characters is going to be married to a large clam. And so there were lots of really ridiculous things that we kind of stuck in there. And so there's one episode, and of course we stole storylines and ideas for different storylines from so many different episodes of not just Star Trek, but also Space 1999 and some other stuff like that. And so but we said, okay, every time we could do this, said what's sort of the inspiration for this particular planet. And so we had at the time, I remember cyberpunk, everything was really a big deal. So we had the episode Shadow Side, the planet Shadow Side, where everything's cyber everything, and we have another episode where the crew all get shrunk. And so every silly trope from science fiction stories, so Twilight Zone and some other things like that. And so we were definitely kind of looking at different episodes and looking for what's sort of our take on that stupid episode of that show or what have you. And so but the bottom line, it was just always about having fun. Be silly. Don't worry too much about whether this is about how believable this is or whatever. Is just make sure that whatever happens, is the gameplay is fun and satisfying if you feel like you're having some progress. But you just have fun with it. And so it's not explicitly a comedy game, but there is a lot of comedy in it.
After, or maybe while finishing Planet's Edge, was there any talk about part 2 where you guys talked about, maybe let's keep that idea for part 2, maybe for an add-on or stuff like that?
Oh yeah, well we had definitely the after as whenever you get to the end of the game, you go back and you've rescued the Earth, and then we were going to have the thing where the moon disappears, and so you have to go figure out what happened with all that other stuff. And so we definitely were talking about there possibly being a part 2, that there were to be a sequel and everything. I had a big plot line where I was planning on doing something that was kind of we spent a lot of time talking, once you get into the last sector, talking about the Secundus, who were these kind of robotic race. And so they were going to be a big part of any sequel that happened. But multiple reasons why that happened, but not the least of which is that by the time I was gone before the final Planet's Edge finally shipped, because I'd finished writing, doing the writing for it, and then I got the offer to go to New World, to Dynamics. And so it there was certainly no reason why they couldn't have done another one, from the standpoint of it did very well for its time period. I think we shipped 225,000 units, which back then was a really decent selling game. But I just think that Eric and I, because the primary team was myself, Eric Hyman, who was the programmer, and then Kenneth Mayfield, who was the artist. We also had several other artists who kind of helped out on it, and other people who were kind of pitching other bits of programming in. But I was gone. Ken Mayfield left not too long after I did. He went up to San Francisco. I can't remember I think he might have gone to work for SSI, but I'm not sure. But whatever the case was, is that most of the team was kind of broken up, and I think that what they were becoming increasingly focused on was, of course, obviously there was Might and Magic, but also Heroes of Might and Magic was not going to be too much further on down the pipeline. They had other products that they were kind of concentrating on, and so I think that they were just trying to figure out is the fact that Might and Magic was their sort of flagship role-playing game, and I don't think that they wanted to, and of course, if you know Might and Magic, you realize is that, well, even though it is a quote-unquote fantasy role-playing game, it's underpinned by science fiction. And so I don't think that they were interested in basically creating a second science fiction, RPG. And so I think that they, were happy with what we had done with the first Planet's Edge. But since I wasn't there, and since Kenneth went off, and then Eric, I don't think he was there much longer than a year or so. So I just don't think there was a lot of impetus to do a second one, at least in terms of once the first one was out the door. We'd kind of laid down foundations for there to be a second one if they decided to go that way. But but yeah, I think that whenever basically the core team was kind of no longer there, they just decided to focus on their real moneymaker, which of course was Might and Magic.
Mhm. After 30 years or so, and in hindsight, do you have any regrets in making gameplay decisions? Maybe you would flesh out some part more, for example, maybe the resource gathering part or stuff like that?
I don't know if I have any specific regrets. I think that there are a lot of things that I would have loved to have done more with. I think that I would have liked to have done more. We had discussed the possibility of having uh, to apply some of the how we were using the resources to build ships and apply that more towards maybe you could build robots
Hmm.
that would you could have with you on missions, and could you build your own base, and there was definitely a lot more of the of course this is pre Sim City,
Hmm.
but we were definitely interested in the idea of so we have the moon base that we were building back at home, and so imagine kind of taking that to the next level further is the fact that you could have some you could colonize a planet, and you would go in and you would build uh, you could manufacture vehicles and other kinds of stuff, and so have uh, kind of more strategy based kind of stuff that would be going on different planets. And so that was stuff that we were sort of interested in, but as it was, that would have been strapping on a strategy game onto what was already a hybrid space flight sim
Hmm.
and an RPG. And I think we just said, okay, we've got enough. We have enough genres that we're straddling right now. Probably adding a third one on for the first game isn't something we should try to do right now. If we had gone to the third game, I think we would have seen uh, us adding some almost something between the kind of strategy elements that you had in King's Bounty, but also having some kind of base building kinds of elements to it. But of course, I remember the whole time that we were there. This was not related to Planet's Edge, but whenever we were there, the talks were going on at the time about making a persistent online world for Might and Magic.
Oh, hmm.
And of course, this is 1991. We nobody's doing this yet, and this is in the early days whenever people are just messing around with MUDs. And so there are no MMOs or anything like that, and Ultima Online is still a few years down the road. So we were definitely having discussions. The issue, the real block there, just had to deal with how many people have dial-up that would be dial-up, and how compressing graphics and all the stuff that still had to be figured out that made online play viable. But how would people play? And all the questions that ultimately that MMOs would have to solve further on down the road. We were having those discussions in 1990 about Might and Magic.
I bet it would have been a very different game if you had to go down on a planet and build a colony and explore the planet with rovers or stuff like that. Would have been cool, of course.
Yeah, I would have loved to have done that, simply because, I think part of the romance of the idea was, go out and colonize planets, and have something that was, in addition to just the exploration aspect of everything, but being able to develop a planet and make it your own. And I think that was a really cool idea, but I think that it was definitely that would have bleeding edge
Hmm.
in terms of the technology and what would have been involved. But like I said, I think we just said that we're straddling two genres right now, and that's probably enough.
Yeah. um, while you describing the principles of the additional content for it, I was thinking of Alien Legacy, game 1994 by Sierra. You weren't involved in
Hmm.
that, right?
No, no,
No,
no.
okay, because it has some kind of SimCity colony management, and you can fly around with your spaceship on the planet in voxel space and stuff like that. So it sounds a lot
Mm.
like that.
No, no, I didn't have anything to do with that. Whenever I was at Sierra, particularly, of course, Dynamics was a part of Sierra Online.
Hmm.
Uh, but while I was there, the vast majority of the time I was in my bunker working on Betrayal at Krondor.
Yeah.
That was definitely my life for most of the time I was there, and so. Uh, as you said, though, Battledrome, I did some stuff for them. It was a really kind of cool situation because there were a lot of other great teams there. I would have loved an opportunity to work on like the Aces of the Pacific game,
Oh yeah.
because Dynamics was making all these fantastic uh, kind of military games at the time. So
Yeah.
there's all the Aces titles. But they had already had a full-time historian who was an honest-to-God historian working for them. I don't know that I could have contributed anything as much as those guys did. But Adventures of Willie Bemis was there. Upstairs above my office was Mark Crow and the guys who did the Space Quest series. Um, but it was we were kind of in our own little silo in some ways. Is that our team? We Other than sort of company meetings and everything else, we didn't really have that much interface with other teams, other than we running into each other, in the common areas of the company. But for the most time, it was just sort of us dealing with our own stuff. Um,
Hmm.
and honestly, I'm grateful for that because I think it would have been. I'm not sure how well I would have handled the distraction of having to deal with other games whenever I was working on Betrayal, because I I I pretty much lived that game for the time I was working on it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I didn't have any. Only other Sierra title that I almost kind of sort of might have had an influence on is before another team ended up getting it. I was initially promised Rendezvous with Rama,
Oh
and I really wish that I'd had
yeah.
that opportunity, because after rolling off working on Ray Feist's thing, the opportunity to develop something based on a Arthur C. Clarke story would have just been gigantic for me, because I was a huge Arthur C. Clarke fan.
Hmm.
But that was one of those things where almost but didn't quite happen for me, and I was really sad about that.
Yeah. Ah, sorry. If you could build a Planet's Edge 2, would you?
I would. Uh, the Whenever we were originally developing Planet's Edge, in the early this is we had a big meeting about what we wanted to call the game, and so we had our little short list of things that we had kind of had generated just between Eric and Ken and I. And our favorite name was Galaxy's Edge,
Hmm.
because that's what we said. We're out flying around the galaxy. We're exploring all this other stuff, and said this is something that really in our minds exemplifies what the feel of this game should be. Is it's about exploration. It's about being out in the galaxy and doing all this other stuff. And we had a marketing guy who said, I think it's a terrible name. I think Planet's Edge is much more evocative.
Okay.
And we're all looking at him going, are you an idiot? But he was the vice president of marketing, and he got his say. But that's the thing with that for me, that if I had the opportunity to do it, I would want to call it Galaxy's Edge, because that's the name I'd always intended this game to have. But of course, now it's frustrating simply because, well, let's see, there's a famous section of Disneyland that
Oh.
is now called Galaxy's Edge. And also, a few years ago, Mike Resnick started, who was a famous science fiction author, has a publication called Galaxy's Edge. And so then now the name is everywhere. But I
Mm.
said, damn it, I had that name in 1990. But but names aside, I think that it would be really great fun to try to develop a Planet's Edge too. I mean, given the fact that it has been so long and the fact that it is a very uh, niche title in terms of, there are a handful of older fans that really love it, and it's not like some of the other games I've worked on where people have discovered it afterwards and they get really into it. Uh, but so in some respects, you would be really kind of starting over from scratch in terms of basically building a new brand with everything. But I would still want to do the same combination of things. I
Mhm.
would still want to have the fly around in space and do that kind of thing, and then beam down to a planet. Then it's an episode of Star Trek. I'd want to keep those basic elements to it. I might try to go ahead and throw in that third genre. Now that more technology is available and everything else. Though obviously, I'd want to make sure that the trouble is making sure that the experience feels balanced. Um, and also too is that the one thing about making the decision initially to say it's half space flight and it's half on the ground is that ultimately you're saying that I'm really trying to appeal simultaneously to two different kinds of players and people who like two different kinds of things, and they don't necessarily overlap. There are some people who say, look at the space combat and say, have the fantasy of, I want to fly a spaceship around and fight other spaceships. That's what, really turns them on. And then there are other people who say, I'm really about the role playing kind of following a storyline kind of experience. And there are definitely people who enjoy both of those experiences, but they aren't necessarily something that everybody enjoys. And so you have to say is, hopefully you can attract both kinds of players, and there's enough of that the experience they enjoy in it to make it worthwhile to sit down and keep playing that game. And so I think it would be a harder game to pitch today and sell than it was for us back in the day. But of course, back in the day, we weren't dealing with a publisher. We were our own publisher. So anything we decided needed to be in the box is what went in the box. We didn't have, somebody sitting up in, in a publishing corporation somewhere else that was making a decision about what was saleable. We didn't care about what was saleable. We said, what's fun to us?
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, honestly, I miss those days of development. Whenever it's not about, okay, well, we've polled, the audience and they want X, Y, or Z. Said, okay, I just made a game that I think is intensely fun to play, and I made the game that I want to play and that I enjoy playing. And honestly, in my opinion, I still think you end up with better games whenever it's not about, we surveyed, these people, and we've identified a particular audience. He said, I made the game that I want to play, and I know there are other people who are like me that will want to buy this game. Now, is it worth? Is it going to be worth the money you're going to drop to make that game? It was a lot easier back in those days, simply because, okay, maybe the game cost you $500,000, $750,000, something like that, not $50 million.
Mhm.
uh, and so you have to justify, can I get this money back? Can I justify the time that it's going to make it and to get that money back? But so I think that's something that's definitely changed between the good old days, whenever it was just basically a bunch of basically guys that were, like living in a dormitory or something. Because it was crazy. It was, a bunch of 20-year-old guys, and it was nuts. Um, and we all lived for games. And yes, we were making money. This is how we were paying our bills. But uh, the attitude of the games was pretty much the way that we lived. Is we were just having fun. We were just grateful we were getting paid to do it. But nobody took anything too seriously. It's like, okay, we're going to make this game and we'll ship it out the door and hopefully somebody buys it.
Yeah, I was about to say we still miss some goofy games because I'm under the impression all the big titles today, even the indie titles, are mostly very, yeah, very straightforward, very honest, save the world and nothing else. When you look at Mass Effect or stuff like that, I think it's boring. It could be good to add some more fun and jokes and silliness.
Mm.
Yeah.
One of the games that's come out in uh, I say recently, but was quite a whiles back. But something that had a lot of that spirit to it was the game Destroy All Humans.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I could just play that sucker all day long because it's just so stupid.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous because you're just flying around and you're stealing cows and I love the fact that it doesn't take itself very seriously, and it's really whatever you want to do with it. And I think the problem is that now the industry is about money. Now, of course, I don't want to give the impression that we didn't care about money at all, because that's not the case, because we were in a company, John Van Canningen is paying all of us to make these games. And so it's not like, we don't care about all that kind of stuff, but there was less pressure about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the whenever you start saying, well, in order to compete, because I'm going to go out in the market, and the fact that I'm going to be competing against all these other games that are out there, and gamers can only buy and play so many games at a time. Um, and so that does mean you're in competition with all the other games that are out there. And now it's insane because now you're not even competing just with other major companies doing stuff. You're all these little indies that are out there. And it makes companies extremely risk averse. And they say, unless we think that we're going to make, 10 times however much we spent making a thing, we're just not even going to try. We're not going to bother. And it also is one of the reasons why you end up recycling the same stuff over and over and over again, is because you've got people sitting at the top that are very risk averse. It says, if we cannot lose money on this.
Mm.
And of course we also have to spend a crap load of money making it, simply because people have expectations now. It's got to have graphics that are like this, and it's got to have 3D, and it's got to have all this other stuff, which means, when we worked on Planet's Edge, we had a core team of 3 people. And then whenever you included all of the extra artists and other people who worked on it, there were probably 8 of us who were working on Planet's Edge. And we spent, maybe a year working on Planet's Edge. And now, it's games are taking 3 years, and they might have, if it's a massively multiplayer game, it's 5 years, and they've got 500 people on staff.
Yeah.
And so you really kind of get caught up in these things of what's my cost risk analysis. What's in the end, how do I make money on this, make something that's fun, but also that people will be enough to kind of stand out of the crowd, that people will buy us. So it's tough. And honestly, I'm kind of glad that I'm sort of semi-retired from the games industry, because I'm not having to do that calculus anymore. I'm sort of back in a position where I was. I do stuff for myself for the most part. That I work on projects that excite me and that I enjoy doing, and I'm back to I make the things that make me happy, and when I get lucky, then that happens to align with other people who like the same kinds of things that I do.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, but yeah, and like I say, I understand how it evolved. I know how we got where we're at, and I don't really bash the people who are these people who are running these corporations, because it's a hard calculus. I mean, these are the decisions we have to make, but the cost of that is sometimes you have to kind of it ends up with titles that aren't necessarily as creative. sometimes they're not necessarily as fun simply because they're just so afraid of taking those risks.
Yeah, sure. But from time to time, we get some small indie developer with one, two, three people that land a
Yes.
very big hit. And yeah, so there is opportunity to produce a fun and big game with a small studio.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, and it's definitely still possible. And honestly, if it's one of those things where you're just kind of doing it out of your own pocket and you're doing it in your spare time, so there's no like real risk to you. In some respects, there's a lot that a small studio can do. That if it's not like we've got everything riding on this, but I'm just doing this for the hell of it, for the joy of it. There's ways in which they can compete with big companies where they have some flexibility, they can move around, and so I think that's kind of an exciting space to be in. For me, the hard part is just the hours because there's a lot of really cool technology. There's you have, but you get Unity, and Unity comes with all these tools that, oh my God, we spent years just building those tools.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you just go out and you get a package of that stuff and it's ready for you. But then there's just all the time that spends, you have to spend to create all the content. So anyway, I think it's kind of cool for people who, particularly who are breaking in and then trying new stuff. I think it's kind of the Wild West. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff that can happen, and certainly I keep my eye out for those little breakout titles and stuff.
Yeah, we all do. So, one last question.
Sure.
On Planet's Edge, when you clone a new character, you can clone a new character whenever you're on your base. What
Right.
exactly happens with the old one? Is he mashed into organic goo and will produce a new one, or?
Well, yeah, essentially, I was trying to remember. It's been so long since I played it. And I said, did you clone people while people were still alive, or or could you only clone someone once they died?
No, you can clone him when they are alive.
Okay, all right. So yeah, see, it's been so long since it happened. Well,
No
I think
problem.
the answer is it's the same as sort of like whenever you're in Star Trek and you jumping into a transporter. uh, is that because my argument back in the day was transporter's a murder machine, right?
Yeah, right.
uh, I jump in the transporter and it vaporizes me.
Yeah,
Now it clones me at the end of the day because there's a new version of me that's walking around the planet that has my memories, but that ain't me.
right.
That's that just happens to be whatever ambient elements are floating around in the air locally, and it reassembles a version that looks like me. So that was sort of my take on what clones were back in the day. Was that I always said that the transporter is actually the worst weapon that could possibly exist. Why do people even bother with photon torpedoes and phasers whenever it says, I'm going to grab a section of your hull and just beam it out of existence? uh, and so I guess you need to have, you say, so I said, the worst are the best possible weapon would have been a transporter beam. And because I could just disassemble your hull and just not reassemble it.
Yeah.
And so I was always, kind of was aghast at the fact that Star Trek never seemed to pick up on this fact. Uh, and I always felt that would be the most dangerous weapon to possibly to have, as be the transporter. But anyhow, so my answer is that yeah, you probably just get sort of they dematerialize you, and you are just sort of created out of fresh materials.
Okay. That sounds much less bloody than my version of it.
And just cram you into the vat.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, was nice talking to you. Thank you for the interview, and I hope if I ever replay one of your other titles, I can ask you again some silly questions.
Well, I would be glad to do it. Has nobody ever actually asked me much about Dungeon Siege, even though I didn't really have as much to do with it? I wrote the story for it, but I didn't really have anything to do with the design. Uh, but I'd love to talk about it because nobody ever asked me about that one. Um,
Oh,
but um, but anyway, but I really appreciate you having me on to talk about Planet's Edge because that's actually, I get a lot of requests to talk about Krondor, but not many to talk about Planet's Edge. And Edge was a very, very great experience because it's the first title I designed from the ground up. And so I have a lot of happy memories about it, and I'm really glad that people still remember it and enjoy it.
yeah. I think it's a great game. I'm having very, very, very funny moments with it, and somehow it even got translated to Germany. So to German, it's funny.
Well, I would actually. I'm glad to know that it translated because that's the one thing. Whenever you that I was kind of worried about with because particularly when you're doing humor, is how well does the humor carry over? I had my book Swords and Circuitry that I wrote, and it got translated into Korean. And there's a bunch of stuff in that book where I'm telling jokes and I'm going, I wonder how that got translated, because humor is so specific to language. And so I'm glad that the humor in Planet's Edge came through. So that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. The humor came through. I think it's a good translation for that time. Yeah.
Good. Awesome.
Yeah. So thank you for the interview and have a nice day and week.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.